John has prepared a short presentation for us, and I want to give him a chance to make his presentation, and then we can have further conversation as the case may be. And I'm going to pass over the
You want to show the book?
Okay, so, well, let's see. To show the book, I need this. Okay. Oh, no. Just leave it. It's got to be on the flat table. Okay, so let's see if I go to transition. Okay, so John has brought a copy of the book, The Addiction to Perfection, The Still Unravished Bride. Okay. This is Marion Woodman's book, Addiction to Perfection, and that certainly parallels my view of Dr. Peterson's work, which is all logos all the time. Here's John's PowerPoint, and let me bring it up for you on here so that you can work with it.
Okay, I'll start off. I put this together today, so it's very quick, and I have not had a chance to practice the presentation, so bear with me. But if you have any questions in the chat, feel free to ask.
Okay, here you are. So you're going to work with...
So this book was published in 1982 by Marion Woodman. It's the title is interesting, The Still Unravished Bride, and what she means by that is she's mainly treating clients who are women who have not experienced life because they've had addictions to mainly food addictions like overeating and anorexia, bulimia, that sort of thing, which are very serious psychological disturbances. And underlying that is the addiction to perfection. So the fundamental addiction to food is and all addictions actually is this idea of being addicted to perfection, which is a masculine quality, a masculine value. We don't tend to think of masculine and feminine in depth psychology as macho and submissive. We tend to think of it more in terms of perfection and wholeness. So the masculine value would be perfection, and the feminine quality would be wholeness.
Okay, so you're going to move your slides by this. Okay, so that's the second slide.
So I just wanted to just complete this idea that the ravished bride that's the symbol for the woman who has discovered her feminine principle. And she opposes that with, it's not meant to be a strident analogy or anything, but probably is somewhat provocative, but the alternative is the raped bride, which would be the woman who is afflicted by this complex having to do with perfection. So this is what Jung had talked about as well for years, the need to bring in the feminine principle and balance the feminine principle with the masculine principle. And there we have some background. Woodman was a Jungian analyst in private practice in Toronto, and she was a diplomate from Zurich. So she was a pretty high-level analyst of the Jungian school. The theme of the book is the same as what Jung had talked about. Repression of the feminine principle is responsible for many of the psychological woes in both men and women. So we're talking about not just women and the women patients that Marion Woodman had, but also this is a problem for men as well, that men need to understand that they need to balance the masculine principle with the feminine principle within their own psyches.
Right, and in Jungian psychology, whenever we're talking about masculine and feminine, we're not talking about gender per se. We are talking about the way Dr. Jung would discuss specific ways things counterbalance one another in the psyche. It could have been red and blue, or it could have been purple and yellow, but for his time and his place, he chose masculine and feminine because it related to the people that he was actually coming in contact with. And so, of course, he's saying that people who are physically women by gender often have a predominance of these feminine characteristics and men the opposite. But it doesn't mean that we don't have feminine characteristics within all men and masculine characteristics within all women. We actually do. And so I think what Dr. Woodman was talking about was these psychological constructs, not specific gender issues per se.
Right. You could think of it as energy, the yin-yang energy as well. So
Right.
This is a better understood concept to some
Right.
people. The history is that, the way she described it, patriarchal values overemphasize and traditionally have overemphasized the masculine principle, and we'll discuss what that is in a minute, which severely represses the feminine values and has caused the feminine principle to react and thrust itself into the collective consciousness. So there's a reaction in terms of an exposure of the negative animus, which is the negative masculine within the
Right, and it's,
female gender generally.
I mean, it emerged at some times in history, for example, Jeanne d'Arc, women like that, but it really started to emerge in the West with Susan B. Anthony and the Katie Stanton and the women at Seneca Falls, New York, who started the push for the women's vote in the 1860s or so. And Susan B. Anthony once commented that when she was being feted, people were cheering her near the end of her life. And she said, usually, and people were throwing roses onto the stage, and she said it used to be that people were throwing bricks. And Susan B. Anthony herself never saw women win the vote because she died before it was achieved. But the feminine principle, or the animus within the feminine principle, was definitely pushing through and saying, hey, we have a mind too.
Right, but it was the negative animus, which is the irony of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what Woodman points out at any rate. So, like I said, this is not masculine and feminine as we usually think of the terms. These are depth psychology terms, and we discussed how the repression of the feminine values affects the psychology of both men and women. So here's the masculine principle. The main drive is to perfection. So when you see a woman taking her kids to a soccer match and then to the art studio and then go to work and come back and get her hair done and then have to cook dinner or supervise children or whatever, that she's doing too much. She's probably the victim of this drive to perfection, to a little bit of an excess. So it's also goal-oriented. There's power involved. There's decisive action, efficiency, the guiding principle, the leadership principle, I guess, logic and reason, which is the logos, discrimination, abstraction, and spirit in the unearthly realms, so more of an abstract idea of spirit. The feminine principle is a drive to wholeness rather than perfection. So we need to, can you explain that a little bit, Skip? It's more like looking at the big picture, right? And
well, it's what women have always done, which is hold the society together while men went off and fought their battles, and the women held civilization together and kept bearing children, and so that we're here today. And
Well, both have kept civilization together.
right,
It's just
both
different
of,
ways.
right,
Different.
but the women in the, through evolution kept the family together. And the difference is that, let's say in year zero in the United Kingdom, or at the time of Stonehenge, the average life expectancy of a human being was 20 years. And so women had nothing to do but bear children during their years after puberty, as many as they could, and they never had time to do anything else. And even 400 years ago, the average age was 40. So women, again, mainly ended up raising a family and then dying, because the average life expectancy was 40, and a lot of them were dying in childbirth and so on. And so women just couldn't get a leg up, so to say.
But as far as the psychological qualities of wholeness versus perfection, what are they addressing exactly there?
Relatedness, well, just the things that you have.
Okay, so we have relatedness, being grounded, power as earth-centered, creative, and regenerative compassion, which is more of a material kind of way of looking at creative energy. Spirit, which is concrete spirit, realistic and material, as opposed to the abstract. An empathy, a feeling, lightheartedness, and expressing life. So
Right.
the main thing that Woodman points out is that if you don't have enough of this feminine principle, you do not have life.
Well, and it's all these issues that were raised in the wisdom part that I was talking about earlier, too, which is we get out into life and we gain wisdom. Everything might seem simple, and when you're 20 years old in the Marine Corps, everything's very simple. You follow the sergeant's orders, but when you get out into life and other things are going on, you have to learn by experience what life is. And so nowadays, because women are living 90 or 100 years, typically they too have a 50-year productive life after child rearing. And so women started to wake up, at least in the West, about 100 years ago, but even more so in the last 50 years. And they say, hey, I have a brain too. And, I've got experience, and I know
And creative faculties.
and I can get things done too. And, in my experience, I've built up several companies, and in most cases, I've done it with very capable women at my side, and not with men, because they're very committed to doing the things that the company needs to do, whereas men tend to think, okay, this is my job today, and what can I think of doing on the side while I'm doing this job? So anyway.
Okay, so to continue, Woodman is saying Western culture is unhealthily skewed toward the masculine principle of perfection. Perfection ultimately is sterile, and it will collapse because once you reach perfection, the only way there then after that is downward. And she says that the balance of the masculine and feminine principles within the self is necessary, and she uses a sailing analogy. And I'm going to read that to you briefly here from page 14 of the book. I am no sailor, but I love to crew for my sailor friend. He takes easy command of the boat, and as I watch him, poised and excited, straining every muscle to keep the craft upright, I suddenly see him as a metaphor of the balance between masculine and feminine. I see the strong body and the keen mind fused in perfect harmony, at once concentrated and relaxed, sensitive to the fierce energies through which we sail. His right hand firmly controls the lines, his fingers sensitive to the shifts in the energy of the wind. His left hand holds the rudder with the same tension, which isn't tension at all, but rather a poised surrender to the energies of the water. And then she goes on to talk about how it's really a knife edge to negotiate this balance between the masculine and the feminine.
Oh, it definitely is. And all of these, this balance between order and chaos that Dr. Peterson often refers to, is the line in the center of the yin-yang symbol. The line that goes right down this center and is curved between the light and the dark is where the balance is, and that's the balance between order and chaos. And my criticism of his recent book, The 12 Rules of Life, is that he's gone very heavily over onto the logos side and not well, let's say this, he does talk about eros in the sense of the various family difficulties that he and his children and his wife have experienced, which are quite substantial over their lifetimes. And so those are eros in nature, but he uses them kind of as a bludgeon to make you go back to the logos. And I'm not sure that that's always the answer. In fact, I'm sure it's not always the answer.
We have a comment. We have a comment from Miles about Hebrew versions of the scripture have Holy Spirit as feminine. Wisdom is Sophia and is feminine. Makes sense, does it not? Yes, Sophia is
right. Well,
a symbol of wisdom.
Right, and that's exactly what I read earlier in this video, in this session.
I want to briefly cover the masculine and feminine principles that Woodman delineates on page 15, and that is, first of all, she says, as human creatures, not gods, we must go for the gray, the steady, solid line that makes its serpentine way only slightly to the left and right down the middle course between the opposites. And that's the differentiated ego, whether male or female, cutting a course between wind and water. Positive masculine energy is goal-oriented and has the strength of purpose to move forward toward that goal. It disciplines itself to make the most of its gifts, etc., etc. Then the feminine principle, this is the positive feminine principle, which is distinguished from the negative feminine. The feminine is a vast ocean of eternal being. It was, is, and shall be. It contains the primordial animals, red in tooth and claw. It contains the potential seeds for life. It knows the laws of nature and exacts those laws with ruthless justice. It lives in the eternal now. It has its own rhythms, slower than those of the masculine, meandering, moving in a spiral motion, seemingly turning back on itself, but inevitably attracted to the light. It finds what is meaningful to it and plays. It may work very hard, but its attitude is always one of play because it loves life. That's a very important, interesting observation.
Say that last sentence again.
It finds what is meaningful to it and plays. It may work very hard, but its attitude is always one of play because it loves life.
So Miles, pay attention to that, because that's what you're saying. You had to go to dinner with some called, and it was very wise of you to go to dinner.
Okay, so continuing, it loves, and if that love is penetrated by the positive masculine, its energies are released to flow into life with a constant flow of new hope, new faith, new dimensions of love. But the spiritual feminine is always grounded in the natural instincts, so that no matter how spiritualized it becomes, it is always on the side of life. In this, it is different from the over-spiritualized masculine in man or woman, which tends to seduce us into the sleep that ends the heartache that flesh is heir to. So some beautiful writing there.
Right.
So we, Skip, how do I move this down? Just
Okay,
tap
so
it a little bit?
yeah, is that
Okay.
is that the next one?
Got it.
Animus? Yeah.
Okay, just to review, the anima and the animus were Jungian concepts. The animus, this is from James Hollis, the animus confers worth, legitimacy, capacity to do one's work in the world. But Woodman is focusing here in this book on the negative animus because that's what's causing a lot of the problem. The negative masculine, because it generates the neuroses. And Hollis describes the negative animus as undermining, ebbing energy away, devaluing, and criticizing, and that it's sadistic. So this is...
Well, he's talking about the part of animus that says, oh, you're not good enough. You
Right.
can't make it. You're just a woman. You can't really make this. And, of course, you have to have the positive animus come back and say, go away.
Well, this is difficult for some people, though.
Surely
it's
it
not. It's not in their consciousness.
Right.
It's repressed, and it has to do with the relationship with the mother, the real mother.
Yeah.
Not to take anything away from mothers. It was just the way that the masculine energy came through that generation of mothers.
Yeah.
So the masculine, she quotes, the masculine, when divorced from the feminine and given an autonomous power for its own sake, reduces kingship to a demonic parody of the real thing. So it's not the real masculine principle. It's this fake image of it.
Oh, you mean like our president saying that he would certainly go into that school without even if he didn't have a weapon to save those kids?
I didn't follow the
You don't
news.
have to comment on that.
Okay. So she uses this analogy of Perseus and Medusa, which is the Greek myth. And Medusa represents the negative animus of a biological female, or it can be the negative animus of a man's anima. So this is affecting both biological genders. So in the myth, Perseus is kind of a troubleshooter. He goes around the kingdom and he solves problems. So when people are when these Greek gods are causing problems, he's the one they call in, like the Clint Eastwood, I guess.
Okay.
So he comes in and his charter is to kill Medusa because Medusa is causing all this evil
Right.
stuff erupting around the world. So she's out of control and dangerous. But he has to approach her with a helmet that makes him invisible. And he has to use a mirror to see her because he can't look at her directly. He would succumb to her evils then.
Yeah.
And then he uses his sword. He tricks her that way, and he sneaks in and he uses his sword to sever her head from her body. And that's what you can see in the photograph there. You can see the mirror, and he's got his sword there, and he's holding the head of Medusa. The psychological analog here is that it's a therapeutic approach that is indirect because the analyst has to sort of approach the patient. Well, they used the term patient in those days, or the analyzans ego, because it is so weak. It is weak from an experience of failure in relationships. That it's weak. It's very weak, and so the person does not have a great deal of self-esteem and so forth. And so the analyst has to approach this problem indirectly, and that's the symbol of the mirror and the invisible, the helmet conferring invisibility. But once Medusa is killed through the connection of the Analazan's perfectionist values to her historical mother, so there has to be a connection made to show that link, then she is free to discover her inner positive feminine in the figure of Andromeda, who's rescued from a rock in the sea by Perseus. So he goes on to rescue Andromeda. Andromeda represents the positive feminine, which is not, these Analazans are not aware of this because it's a repressed quality. So the feminine principle has to be discovered in, it's there, and it's probably talking, but it's talking in the background. It has to be felt out and brought to the fore,
Right.
made conscious. So this is a picture of pictures of Medusa with the snakes. She had snakes in her hair, 1,000 snakes apparently. And Woodman also calls the Medusa the demon lover in the book. And the goal of therapy is to release Andromeda. So that's discovering and freeing the positive feminine, which has never been experienced consciously.
This is the goal of therapy for women, for her client.
For her clientele.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. However, it can be. There's an analog for men as well. That they have to discover that feminine quality as well. If they're out of balance.
Right, if they're out of balance.
You look at your type A, your executive, they're hard-charging perfectionists. Well, they're going to need this as well.
Yeah, they're definitely out of balance.
So she relates the power goddess which is power goddess would be the Medusa, to the early matrix with the mother on page 22. And she basically says the matrix, the mother matrix isn't there. So there's connection difficulty with the mother, with the real mother. Mm-hmm. And she even goes into this very interesting little dialogue about how the concept of God, so we're talking about highly abstract concepts here. The concept of God is the pleroma before God created matter and the world. So it's a pure abstraction. Mm-hmm. There's no connection with the body. There's no concept of God as having a body. So inflation results. And the stricken person then is not in touch with her body or with life. So it has with the feminine, with the biological female, it has a lot of body aspects to it.
So what is her distinction between ravished and raped?
Ravished would be the quality of feminine energy flowing through her to do good in the world, or to do her life's destiny in the world. Whereas raped would be this perfection, being enslaved to this perfection and being abused by it and not being able to live.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, that's my simplistic explanation of it. She moves on to talk about Macbeth, and there is it's a Shakespeare play, dramatizes the damaging physical and psychological effects of political ambition. Okay, the story is about Macbeth, who's a Scottish general who is consumed with ambition and spurred to action by his wife, murdering the king and taking the Scottish throne for himself. Then they both suffer from guilt and paranoia and are forced to commit more and more murders. So it unleashes this whole chain of evil and destruction. And Lady Macbeth kills herself, and Macbeth is conquered by his enemies in the end. So he uses this as Macbeth. Lady Macbeth represents the negative animus, again, just similar to Medusa. And her quote is, "When Lady Macbeth's masculinity usurps her femininity, Macbeth confronts her not as my dearest love, but as a triple-headed witch who takes possession of him." And you can read the rest of the slide there. And she goes on to say that many women are now, this was written in 1982, many women are now refusing to be Lady Macbeths. It denies, they're seeing that it's this trend toward perfection is denying their true nature as women. And there was a very intriguing discussion about what would have happened if Lady Macbeth, instead of egging on her husband to be a masculine guy and go in and kill Duncan so that they can have the throne, what if she had come up to him and said, "Well, explain to me why you have a resistance. What is your feeling of resistance to this idea?" So it's
I'm not following you.
Well, resistance to the idea of killing Duncan. He has a resistance. She's egging him on.
Right.
Okay, so let's assume that she has her feminine principle intact instead of like pushing him through ambition and power, because it's all about power.
Right.
The negative animus. Then what if she had related to him his emotions and, well, I see you don't want to do this.
Right.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about your emotions. So it's more of a holding the lamp up to her husband.
Mm-hmm. But then what would have happened? Still the same thing? Duncan gets killed?
No, presumably she would have been able to work through, he would have recognized his true self, and he would have backed down to this insane plan. Because,
I see.
Okay, so, I don't know if I have it right as far as...
Not the everybody dies result, right?
Yeah, everybody, it's so destructive.
Right.
In fact, it was so destructive that backstage they called it the Scottish play instead of Macbeth, because
really?
they thought there was a curse if they said the word called the play Macbeth. So it had a very powerful influence on the people performing
Right,
the play.
I'm sure it did.
Okay, and she makes a dramatic connection between food addictions and this drive to perfection. Mm-hmm. Because food embodies the false values that a woman's own bodies refuse to assimilate. So they protest. The bodies protest. They become edemic, bloated, allergic, or resort to vomiting the poison out. The unconscious body, and certainly the conscious body, will not tolerate the negative mother.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks a lot in this book about food addiction and addictions in general. And there's a lot of discussion with dream processing and so forth with her analyzans. And so I only have one slide on this, but it really does dominate the whole book, because it equates food with the physical form of the woman, and how that is the physical form of the woman is actually the integrity of the woman in terms of the feminine principle. So the ability to live through the body is key to this book, and men really don't have to deal with that so much. And then the creative purpose of the neuroses. So she says it is a neurosis, and it has a creative purpose. And I wanted to read you that. The creative purpose of the neurosis is to bring the woman to confront within herself the negative mother which her feminine body naturally rejects. The negative mother is a foreign substance. It is alien. It does not belong to her any more than do 2 pounds of chocolates before she goes to sleep. Her body is demanding that she differentiate herself out from it, so that she can discover who she is as a mature woman. The task which her own mother may have failed to perform, she must perform. That is the new consciousness, the giant leap, the healing in her own life, which she is being called upon to incorporate. So I just want to give a quick summary. Both men and women in Western society have for centuries repressed positive feminine values of wholeness and relatedness. Result is the emergence of the negative animus, and the central manifestation of this is addiction to perfection. Healing means disabling the negative animus, especially for a woman, while discovering and promoting the positive feminine. So we go back into those positive feminine qualities, values, that she must learn because they have been repressed, so they're unknown to her. Okay. The process applies to both males and females, probably a little bit less to males, but it depends on the male. And the result is the ability to creatively pursue life free of the sufferings and punishments of perfectionism, being not good enough, the addictions, inflation, coupled with depression, etc.
Right.
And that's the presentation.
Okay, so Miles has a couple of points here. Have you heard of Christian religionists called complementarianism? It is chauvinist. Men are authoritarian patriarchs. Not surprising that many women are turned into feminists. What do you think? Well, first on that comment, Miles, I do agree that there would be a tendency toward compensation psychologically. So there's certainly a tendency to, at least unconsciously, to fight back from that. And he says, Miles says, Mormons are an example of complementarianism, I believe. Basically, the concept is women are helpers. The Iroquois, conversely, have a clan mother with authority to remove a male leader for misconduct. Very interestingly, Miles, in a book called The Discoverers by Daniel Borston, who used to be the Librarian of Congress, there's a story about the Iroquois because there was a diplomat, American diplomat, who was very interested in the Iroquois nation at one point, and he believed that because language changed so fast, you could not figure out who the Iroquois were based on tracing language back. Let me transition this here. But he believed that he could find the Iroquois in the world, where they came from, by looking into their organizational structure of their tribes, which is based on this clan mother idea. And so he made the organizational structure of the Iroquois. This is in 1840 now, so long before photocopiers. And he sent it to diplomatic posts around the world, 200 of them. And only one came back, and it was from present-day Sri Lanka, Ceylon. And there, the Tamil tribe has the same organizational structure as the Iroquois. And so by that, he was able to discover the origin of the Iroquois in North America. And it was mainly because of this matriarchal structure.